Good morning, panelists and participants. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the Danky Pawley Symposium in Print Culture History, which celebrates and reflects on 10 years of the James P. Danky Fellowships at the Wisconsin Historical Society and the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture. My name is Jonathan Senchyne. I am the director of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture and a professor in the School of the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture is a 28-year-old research center housed in what was then the School of Library and Information Studies and is now the iSchool at UW-Madison. And it works in partnership with university libraries and the Wisconsin Historical Society to foster research, teaching, and engagement around the intersection of people and textual technologies. This morning, we have the second of 2 days of presentations from our former fellows, and also we will close with a keynote by Maria Del Bello, who was an early associate with the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture. We are joined by our panelists from yesterday and today here in our Zoom webinar format. We're also joined by Jim Danky, one of the founders of the center and founder of the fellowships. We have to thank for the fellowships, Jim and Christine's, Jim Danky and Christine Shellshorn's generosity for endowing these fellowships and making them possible with major gifts, and also Jim Danky and Christine Pawley, former director of the Information School and former director of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture, for their gift that made this symposium possible. So thank you to all. I also want to take a moment to thank Heather Waka. Heather, do you want to come back on camera? There you are. I'd like to thank Heather Waka for coordinating the symposium and coordinating the center's work. Heather is a former postdoc of the center and is now the administrative coordinator for the center. And without her work in the background and the foreground, we would not be able to do programs like this. Heather, you'll show up in the, because it's on speaker mode, if you unmute and say thank you, your image will show up for everyone.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jonathan, for that. It's my pleasure, and it's been a wonderful conference. I'm so enjoying it.
Thank you. I also didn't mean to instruct Heather to say thank you. I could see her saying thank you under mute, so it wasn't like, here's your line, please express gratitude. The comical things that Zoom can bring up. Yeah, and thank you to our great panelists yesterday and today. I'm really looking forward to our conversations today and the connections between all that you're doing. As I said, this event marks 10 years of the James P. Danky Fellowships, which we offer through the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture. We run the application process every spring semester. We are now, because of the generosity of Jim Danky and other donors, we're able to usually offer 2 fellowships a year now to do research at the WHS. If you'd like to learn more about these fellowships, you can find information at our website, wiscprintdigital.org. That's W-I-S-C, not like the kitchen tool. And you'll find information about our other programs, including lectures that we have on campus, our book series at the University of Wisconsin Press, our biennial conferences, and other things that we're up to every now and again here at our wonderful center. The program for the day is that we will begin with our morning panel with 2 papers, one from Joshua Mitchell, the other from Daniel Joslyn. We'll hear first from Joshua then Daniel will have time for Q&A. A note about Q&A. There are two ways to ask a question for attendees here in the Zoom webinar setup. You can either put it into the chat feature where it can be read out by either Heather or myself to the panel, or you can use the more formal Q&A box. Either one will work. And the only thing is the Q&A box makes it a little bit easier to find them if you want to ask a question early on in the panel, instead of having us scroll back in a question. If you've asked a question and one of us on this side of the Zoom is not finding it, just ask it again. We're not ignoring it. It just may be that we haven't scrolled back into the chat or something like that. So there'll be time after both the morning panel and the keynote for questions, and the way to get them to us is either the chat or through the Q&A. So thank you very much for being here. Without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Joshua Mitchell. And Josh, I'm going to stop my screen share so that you can put up your slides. And I will introduce Josh. Joshua Mitchell is a lecturer in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and was the 2017 James P. Danky Fellow. He writes about the cultural history of North American prisons, and his work is forthcoming in the journal Film History. So please join me in welcoming Joshua Mitchell to give a paper entitled Peer Review in the Penal Press. Thank you, Josh.
Perfect, and you can see the slides, correct?
We can.
Perfect. So first, let me express my gratitude to you, Jonathan, and also to Heather for your work in organizing this symposium. I think it's really generated some really excellent conversations. Thanks also to the other panelists. I learned a lot from your papers yesterday, so I'm looking forward to the conversation today as well. It's been really interesting to see how we've used the same periodicals collection and had these different but overlapping projects. So thank you all for the work that you've done. And thank you as well, and especially to Jim Danky and Christine Pawley for your work and for your generosity. It's been really meaningful to me during my research and continues to be, so I want to let you know how much I appreciate your support in doing the work, some of which I'm going to present today. Now, the work that I do looks at various cultural technologies in North American prisons. So my dissertation, which I defended last year, is about the history of film and television in prisons. And that history starts in 1907 with the earliest films that I could find being shown to imprisoned people. And more recently, I've been doing research on the history of sound technologies in prison, including broadcast radio and PA systems. And whereas, a lot of prison historians look at wardens' reports and other state government documents to study prison life, what I have found to be most indispensable for creating this cultural history of the prison has been the penal press. So these are just a couple of examples of penal press newspapers. The first is one published at Kingston Penitentiary in Canada. The middle one is from Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Prison, and the Oahu Prison in Hawaii. And as I was trying to figure out what would be most meaningful to share about my work in today's talk, I wanted to sort of start with the stuff that people find most surprising when I talk to them about my research. So firstly, before the 1960s, imprisoned men and women across the US and Canada published their own newspapers. And then secondly, probably the second thing that people find the most surprising is that these publications, which were written, edited, illustrated, and printed by imprisoned staffs, circulated not only within their home institutions, but also between prisons as well. So number one, prisoners published their own newspapers, and number two, they traded these papers with people writing newspapers at other prisons. Now, imprisoned authors in North America have written, curated, and circulated their writings in newspaper or zine format since the 19th century, and continue to. But I specifically look at this period in the mid-20th century, where this practice had developed into a unique inter-prison franchise in which prison journalists could exchange their papers with their peers at other institutions. This exchange of prison publications allowed imprisoned journalists to read, cite, republish, and sometimes plagiarize each other's stories. And it really formed this, this rich dialogue far beyond the boundaries of a single carceral site. So for instance, this is from The Candle, which was published at Wisconsin State Prison. Journalists writing for The Candle read and commented on articles published in The Periscope from Florida State Prison, Shadows from Oregon State Penitentiary, and The New Era from the US Penitentiary, the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. And in the title of my talk today, I call this exchange that imprisoned people had in their writings a form of peer review, because so much of it is a comment on each other's work. These papers circulated widely in their time, and today I think they serve as a valuable resource for periodical study scholars, as well as historians of imprisonment, to remind researchers that imprisoned people have long been capable and inventive authors of their own lives. So nearly every prison in the country was touched by this massive enterprise in prison print culture. The Ohio Penitentiary News boasted in 1955 that the penal press had reached a circulation of 1 million readers across approximately 200 titles, adding that, and this is a quote, "Each one speaks for the prison inmate and occasionally for the prison administration." The imprisoned staffs who wrote and edited and illustrated and printed these papers took great pride in the professionalism of their operations. So despite the fact that editors traded their papers by mail rather than receiving news by electric telegraph, the penal press was sometimes imagined as a wire service that spread news across an archipelago of otherwise isolated institutions. Editors used the moniker penal press to mimic wire services such as the Associated Press, and they used the abbreviation PP when they were reprinting news from a penal press affiliate, just as one would do when reprinting articles as AP from Associated Press. Many of these publications funded their operations through a hybrid model of state funding on the one hand and subscription fees on the other, which charged outside readers for the monthly or weekly circulation of the paper. Funding also occurred from local business advertising, such as the Carson City and Reno businesses that advertised in Nevada State Prison's monthly magazine, Rainbow. Boasting the success of their publication, Rainbow writers suggested it would be a, quote, good investment for other companies to present their wares in our pages while the opportunity still exists. And while there was substantial variation in what these papers might look like, a typical penal press publication could include an editorial, national and international news, short fiction, columns that had been reprinted from other penal press papers, wardens and chaplains columns, sports pages, humor columns, quizzes, crossword puzzles, poetry, cartoons. It's hard to really encapsulate what a typical paper might look like. Editorials were written by a newspaper's imprisoned editor and often cover topics related to prison management or reform. Another common topic for the penal press editorials was justifying the existence of prison journalism itself, characterizing it as a useful component of prisoners' rehabilitation. News sections were diverse in their scope and could draw attention either to local or international news. And common themes for prison news sections included updates in the administrative policies of other prisons, as well as changes in state or national laws governing imprisonment. And they often learned this news from their peers at other working for other penal press publications. These publications circulated far beyond the walls of the individual institutions, and they were traded between editors at distant prisons. This vast circulation of printed matter through the penal press allowed for a dissemination of news between these disparate locations, allowing imprisoned journalists to create communion with other imprisoned people thousands of miles away, really altering the popular view of prisons as these hermetically sealed spaces devoid of any kind of social interactivity. In addition to being traded through the mail, they were routinely passed secondhand between imprisoned readers at a single institution. They were read by prison wardens and staff, as well as by state governors and other politicians. Some wardens even maintained columns in the papers addressed to the imprisoned readership. Although prisoners' families were often able to receive penal press publications, in fact, this was part of the funding model of many of them, there were also exceptions to this rule. So the Inside World at Mississippi State Penitentiary announced in 1951 that it would not be able to send copies of their paper to individuals outside of prisons because their mimeographs couldn't accommodate the high demand. And they consoled their imprisoned readers by writing, quote, "We are glad to see that we are putting out enough copies so that each and every one of you will be able to have the opportunity to read it yourself." News articles and editorials originating in the penal press made manifest a strikingly different temporality than the news agencies that they parodied, which relied on telegraphic services to receive information quickly and efficiently for the purpose of dissemination. Meanwhile, the penal press relied on the Postal Service to receive word from editors at other institutions, which created delays of weeks or months in their communication with each other. This delay nonetheless fostered fraternal association among the mostly male editors of the penal press, who frequently joked and complained and teased one another in their respective papers. While penal press publications are indispensable, I think, to the historical study of prisons and imprisoned people, they are astonishingly understudied. And this is due in large part, I think, to the fact that there exists really no central depository in which penal press papers are archived. Instead, prisoner-edited newspapers and magazines are dispersed across the United States in state libraries, state historical societies, university libraries. Really, the closest thing that does exist to a central depository is WHS, but a researcher interested in the penal press as a whole across its hundreds of publications, which were published in every state, as well as in Canada, has to travel state by state to assemble a nationwide understanding of these papers and their circulation. So for me, this required multiple cross-country road trips. And you can see from this map that there's still a number of papers that I have not been able to access yet, but a number of cross-country road trips in the hope of piecing together shards of a widely disseminated archive. These are the states that I visited to get examples of penal press publications. Despite its incredible reach across the continent, historians of imprisonment have typically limited their studies to individual prison papers, rather than to the broader franchise of the penal press as a whole. By collecting the papers of the penal press, which are scattered in archives across the continent, I want us to be able to assemble a new archive through which we can view the views and demands, as well as the critical philosophical output of imprisoned men and women. One of the things that I find really interesting is that we learn quite a bit about the material journeys of the penal press through its current status in the archive. In my travels to state libraries and historical societies, I found that many libraries possess copies of prison newspapers that were submitted to the library directly by newspaper editors at the time of the paper's original publication. So they were sent to the state library in the 1940s or 50s for posterity, indicating that prison journalists had the foresight to preserve the content they published for future readers. In some cases, the copies held in state libraries are missing columns or images that have been clipped out, likely to become artwork on cell walls, or to become secondary circulation free from the remainder of the rest of the periodical. Many copies of Iowa State Prison's Presidio, for instance, preserved and bound at Iowa State Library, are missing their covers, presumably because prisoners use the illustrated covers as artwork to decorate their cell walls. In addition to missing covers or cutout columns, some archived issues of penal press papers are decorated with marginalia written by their original readers. So this is an example of marginalia in an entertainment column. Because reading materials were often shared between imprisoned readers, however, written comments in periodicals were not always welcome. In an article titled "Stop the Vandalism," a writer for Kingston Penitentiary's Telescope complained that his prison's, quote, literary censor, who damaged prison library materials by scribbling away, and this is a quote, scribbling away to his heart's content, having little regard that he is defacing the book. The author also criticized those who, quote, clip from magazines any picture which they may wish to adorn their cell walls, rendering the texts practically useless to any serious reader, end quote. Admonishments such as these were by no means rare in the pages of prison periodicals, and writers for these publications took it upon themselves to instruct their readers in the proper decorum of prison readership. A great deal of humor and experimentation made its way into the penal press. One example of this that I happen to really like is the 1954 April Fool's issue of Louisiana State Penitentiary's Angolite, which featured far-fetched headlines such as "Beer goes on sale here tomorrow," "Bowling alleys to be built," and "Angola doomed by soil experts," which made the claim, the last of which made the claim that the land on which the prison was built was now barren, signaling the end of prisoners' field work in prison cotton fields. In the following issue of the paper, the editor had to clarify to angry readers that its headline promising that the Louisiana governor had acted to free 614 prisoners was in fact a ruse as part of the April Fool's issue. The penal press owed at least some of its popularity to the cult of personality that sprung up around some of its editors, many of whom were known throughout the entire circuit. The Angolite's April Fool's author, William Old Woodeneer Sadler, was among the most regarded. So that's Sadler on the left in this, the left of the two images. Sadler was an immensely prolific journalist, editing two papers, the Angola Argus and the Angolite, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and he also co-founded a third paper, This Is It, at the Tennessee State Prison, across his 3 different prison sentences at the 2 prisons. He also worked on a series of exposés titled Hell on Angola for the New Orleans City newspaper. As evidence of his notoriety within the penal press, after he was released from his first sentence in 1942, Folsom Prison's Observer newspaper described him as, quote, a nationally famous founder and militant editor. Another well-known penal press editor was Tom Runyon of Iowa State Prison's Presidio, that's him on the right. Runyon authored the popular column Leaves from a Lifer's Notebook, which was reprinted in countless other papers throughout the penal press. He described his experience as an editor in an autobiography titled In for Life, a Convict Story, writing, quote, "Now I was working for convicts, not for the hated state. Now I had a chance to give a few outsiders the truth about prisons, explaining some of the troubles and injustices that beset them." Sadler, Runyon, and other editors all communicated with each other in a portion of these publications called the exchange page. These exchange pages were one of the most common features of these papers in the entire circuit. Editors would use the exchange pages to comment on the editorials, artwork, and composition of the papers with which they traded. So for example, a letter from Rudy Cruz in Oklahoma's Outlook to the editors of Kentucky's Barometer read, "Congratulations to the new editor, attractive, colorful cover. Cousin Abner's letter to Jake was a masterpiece and just plain great. The article, I Will Never Drink by Drunk Mr. Anonymous was good for 1,000 laughs. We may reprint it in our next issue, end quote. As was characteristic of Exchange Pages, Cruz compliments the Kentucky paper's cover art and articles and expresses consideration of reprinting some of its material, which was typical among penal press newspapers reprints, as long as these reprints were properly attributed to their originator. In the same page, Cruz wrote similar notes to editors from US and Canadian prisons as distant as The Clock at Idaho State Penitentiary, The Spokesman at Georgia State Prison, The Pathfinder at Saskatchewan Penitentiary, and The Beacon at Dorchester Prison in New Brunswick. Not having an Exchange page or not mentioning an Exchange partner's newspaper were both causes for criticism in the culture of mid-century prison journalism. And although commonly celebratory of other papers, the Exchange page was also a place where editors could criticize each other's work, either seriously or in jest. So this is a December 1939 issue of Iowa State Reformatory's Hawkeye. It sent a soft criticism to the authors of Periscope at the US Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, writing, "Your mag is okay, but for one thing, it's shy of a longer sports column. Come on, you sports bugs, let's get writing." And Exchange Pages could even be imagined as a romance between Exchange partners, and I absolutely love this one. This is one of my favorites. This is from The Reflector, published at the Minnesota State Reformatory for Women. And it adorned its two-page spread of Exchange messages with images of a man and woman, each encircled in a heart and connected by a telephone cord. So this was at the top banner of their two-page Exchange column. Largely dependent on financial circumstances, available machinery, and administrative oversight, prison journalism of the era used a number of different, thank you for the warning, used a number of different printing techniques. Some prisons had their own print shops in which imprisoned workers were trained to print official state documents. Others used professional services outside the prison, such as Michigan's Northlander, which encouraged others in the amateur press to use their Chicago copying service. Although penal press papers used a variety of reproduction techniques, by far the most common was the mimeograph due to its relative affordability, its easiness to use. Mimeographs allowed prisons without access to print shops to publish their own content without relying on outside services. The mimeograph was an especially common publication technique for penal papers from women's institutions, since women's reformatories lacked the print shops that were sometimes housed in men's prisons. The production of complex and colorful cover art was central to many penal press publications, and some papers used silk screening techniques to make such cover art. Some penal press publications with relatively limited circulations even hand-colored their covers with paint or crayon. So these are, again, from the Minnesota Women's Reformatory. And I hope you can tell from these images that the covers are hand-colored using paint and crayon and gold leaf. Although the penal press was a broad enterprise in its own right, reaching nearly every prison and reformatory in the United States and Canada, the prisoner-edited papers were distributed as part of an even larger circulation of print matter in prisons. This distribution of periodicals created discerning reading publics among an increasingly literate prison population. Penal press publications circulated alongside these outside periodicals, and prison newspapers could even be used to facilitate the trade of reading materials between different prisoners. For instance, Minnesota State Prison's newspaper, The Mirror, regularly featured submitted announcements that requested magazine and newspaper swaps with other prisoners. These journalists of the penal press possessed shrewd research skills, even with their limitations behind prison walls, to craft thoughtful editorials about parole reform, juvenile justice, and the nature of prison journalism. Nevertheless, and unlike the radical intellectuals that would become emblematic of underground prison writing in later generations, the penal press intellectuals of the mid-20th century were situated by their position as largely white journalists, and their circuit is bursting with really demeaning racist and sexist cartoons, jokes, commentary, and reporting. These subjectivities of penal press writers are significant for considering the incredible undertaking of their endeavor, which included building and promoting a press circuit with hundreds of newspapers with a readership that spanned from prisoners to state officials. Their subjectivities as prisoners, of course, shaped the concerns and demands of the penal press circuit. However, their subjectivities as almost exclusively white men also informed the production of the press, and white supremacist and anti-Black opinions shaped the prison journalism of the early and mid-20th century. William Sadler in Louisiana, for instance, wrote sympathetically of white prisoners who self-harmed with razor blades to avoid the harsh labor conditions and corporal punishment that were endemic at Angola prison, but he reported that Black prisoners who engaged in very similar acts of self-injury were selfish for doing so. So there's quite a bit of disparity in how stories are reported in the press. By the end of the 1960s, the government-funded and subscription-based penal press was largely defunct. It would be supplanted by radical and underground publications, which are sometimes described as penal press by researchers, but which lacked the government funding, the circulation, and the administrative approval that were characteristic to the mid-century franchise. And as far as I can tell, these later papers didn't really refer to themselves as penal press, as did these earlier periodicals. Many of the most active prison publications ceased in the 1960s, and those that survived no longer circulated between institutions for comment and republication. Undoubtedly, extensively publicized prison uprisings in protest of racism and corporal violence, such as those at New York's Attica prison in 1971, put the last nail in the coffin of the state-sanctioned penal press. A small fraction of these papers do still exist today. The Angolite continues to be published in Louisiana. The San Quentin News was resurrected in 2008 after decades of absence. The mid-century penal press, however, characterized most prominently by its government sanction and its exchange between prisoners, had ceased. What was lost in the circuit's passing was a forum for interactivity that linked remote institutions through a network of reciprocal exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, for that great paper. I'm already seeing many connections to the things we were talking about yesterday, and it's really, really great. Thank you so much. I will just remind everybody that had we been in a room together, there'd be much clapping, so we can fill that in, and Daniel and Joshua should let the idea of applause wash over him for that great talk. Next up, let's see. Josh, can you unshare screen? Perfect. No problem. Daniel, that should allow you to share your screen and come up. Great. And you'll also want to unmute. Perfect. Great. All right. So next up, we have, I think, our most recent fellow, who's just our last fellow in our series, who visited, I think, in the summer of 2019, if I'm remembering correctly. So next we'll hear from Daniel Joslyn. Daniel is a PhD candidate in history at the New York University. His dissertation recovers the largely forgotten turn of the century transnational mystical anarcho-socialist movement. He has contributed multiple entries to the Encyclopedia of the American Left, and his writings have appeared in Religion Dispatches, Marginalia Review of Books, The Revealer, and The Christian Century. He is an active organizer in the Democratic Socialist and Mutual Aid movements in New York City, and is currently building 2 archive projects, one an online accessible archive for mutual aid organizers, and an online leftist syllabus exchange. Great, thank you, and the floor is yours, Danielle.
Thank you so much. Yes, I was there in the summer of 2019 in a place that completely changed this frantic pitch of my research. And I wanted to first express my deep gratitude to everyone, as everyone else has, to Jim Danky, to Heather for your almost offensive level of kindness and generosity and willingness to put up with me as I say I'd like to do this, and then I get COVID, and my mom gets stuck with me for 3 months, and my whole life blows up, and back and forth, and then I get it again. And I really, really appreciate the generosity, the spirit of just sort of welcome that I've experienced throughout my experiences with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and with the archives in particular, and with Jim Danky in particular, and having gotten to have lunch with him, which was just delightful. Unlike other panelists, I don't work on pictures as much. I don't have good images in the same way. I think that every panelist that I've had, I've just been like, wow, I've been blown away by that I've seen. I've been blown away by yeah, the quality of images that people have been able to find. And me, I'm interested in this sort of mystical socialist movement, but I'm really interested in advertisements. My big question is, how does stuff become popular? How do socialist movements find followings, gain followings? And particularly this movement that I've discovered in the late 19th century, which was sort of a feminist socialist movement before Marx came in and said those things are fundamentally separate. And particularly this chapter where there's this book called Carezza, which is what I'm putting on your screen. And this is an advertisement for it, and we're gonna go through this together, which becomes really important in the New Woman movement of that era, and in ultimately, in odd ways, the socialist movement. And I say in odd ways because we're not used to thinking of a mystical sex manual being an important socialist tool ever, but definitely not in the Debsian era of socialism. And definitely not a mystical socialist tool that promises complete control of the fecundating powers. So what's going on here? So in 1896, the spiritualist women's physician Alice Bunker Stockham published her sex manual Carezza, in which she laid out a theology of sex and sexual practice that emphasized 1, the inherent access that all humans had to an indwelling divine power, which 2, sex rightly practiced could be one of the most powerful means of harnessing, which would allow people to 3, have access to particular creative and healing powers, as well as to live more perfect lives day to day. In order to do so, they needed to 4, exalt the spiritual and subordinate the physical in everything, and especially in sex. Carezza was to be engaged in by a married couple who would spend the day or even multiple days or weeks beforehand reading spiritual literature, meditating together, and concentrating on the divine. The exact recommendations are either read, quote, Emerson or Edward Carpenter. This training would teach each lover to, quote, give up their own will and relinquish themselves to God, or cosmic consciousness, as she called it, borrowing from Whitman. So they would work themselves up to a, quote, complete but quiet union of the sexual organs, in which they would submerge, quote, their whole being into one another and experience, quote, exquisite exaltation. Most importantly, in order to reach this pleasant, mutually strengthening ecstasy, both partners needed to keep themselves from losing control and orgasming. There were a number of reasons for this, but most importantly, it's because Stockham saw sex as having 2 functions. One was higher and one was lower. The higher function allowed for spiritual procreation, and the lower for physical procreation. Mastering the higher function would allow married couples both to produce better physical offspring and harness powerful spiritual energies. In doing so, Carezza promised to turn, quote, the young old lady to should become the regenerated new woman, the glory and inspiration of a coming time. So what does this mean? If they practiced Carezza sex, women would be able to choose when and how and with whom they had children, and those children would be measurably better than any other children. Moreover, it would be one step towards women's complete independence from men and freedom to live wholly self-possessed lives. Carezza came out of a long tradition that I was actually able to study in excruciating and surprising detail at the Wisconsin Historical Society, because there's all these documents that I thought had been lost to time that had been kept in various people's archives, including, you know, this sex survey that I'd heard about someone doing in the 1890s, using words such as fucking and cunts, and very explicitly interviewing working class people about their sex lives in a way that no scholar has really written about yet. And this tradition is particular to the utopian socialist tradition. It emerges directly out of the writings of a man named John Humphrey Noyes and a commune in upstate New York called the Oneida Commune. And it's the practice that he introduced was called Bible communism, or specifically male continence, in which men were supposed to be continent. It's a very self-explanatory process. Yeah, the Oneidans, free love, nice plates, good silverware. And it's a whole story. But out of the Oneida Commune emerged this movement called Alphaism, this movement called Dionism, which, because of the Wisconsin Historical Society collections, I now have a whole article on that is spiraling. But my dissertation is about Carezza, which in 1896 is the direct outgrowth of this practice. And between 1896 and 1920, when all of these other utopian socialist literatures had only been read by maybe a few hundred people in the sex radical presses, Carezza took off, spreading across US, American, British, German, British and German radical circles, particularly among the, quote, nascent New Woman, socialist and anarchist movements, and was part of a developing feminist socialism that became a major part of the discourse among leftist practitioners of New Age religions, and was quite well known and represented in the wider left. It did so in no small part because it provided many women a means of justifying their place within the public sphere and demanding spiritual and mundane equality in their everyday relationships. New women, so to stop us for a second, go back, were a class of laborers and a cultural ideal that emerged at the turn of the century as women exploded into the marketplace and public sphere. These women adopted less restrictive forms of dress, actively engaged in sports and dance halls, and took on jobs across most industries, from professions to the service industry. They were central to the suffragist movement and to what would become known in the 1910s as the feminist movement. They demanded as much equality as possible, including the ability to work the same jobs as men, rise through the ranks and enter the professions like men, and also to be paid the same or receive even sometimes more protections than men in working class jobs. At home, they demanded an end to male domination, equality in relationships, and the ability to choose when and how they would like to have sex and ultimately have children. To new women, Carezza offered a way of connecting all of those things. And Carezza sold around the world of new thought, a new religious movement that emerged led by women and intertwined with the new woman movement. Advertisements for Carezza and advocacy for various offshoots of it started appearing immediately across the New Thought press and being sold as sign-on bonuses in the largest New Thought magazine, The Nautilus. Because I can't track what people did in their individual lives, the way that I've been trying to figure out what Carezza did for people is through advertisements, as you can see here. Carezza was advertised all around because Alice Bunker Stockham owned her own publishing company, a publishing company that Tolstoy, who in fact actually translates Carezza into Russian, commended, a publishing company which is this odd blip because it gets completely destroyed and erased from history in 1909 by Comstock and censorship laws, but which is really important in the sort of forgotten moment of New Woman radicalism. So Stockham herself included sort of a handful of the thousands of letters that she'd received from grateful women across the country in various editions of Carezza. And she included pages, as you can see here, of different notable figures speaking to the efficacy of Carezza. For example, one effusive reviewer wrote that Carezza, quote, had brought to light true marriage and true womanhood as well. I am no longer conscious of being a separate being, ministering to the animal desires of my husband as he ministered to mine. Or another wrote, quote, one of the blissful results of this vita nuova is that we are both perfectly unmoved by others. We are sovereigns in the sphere of our own personal beings. No other crosses the frontier. International translations of Carezza echoed this sentiment, with the introduction, for example, to the German translation, which would go on to sell 40,000 copies and then be reissued and retranslated by a different author in the 1920s, which would sell another 50,000 copies, declaring that Carezza would lead to, quote, a revolution in sexual relations and placing it at the center of a transnational movement. Very quickly, Carezza also found an audience outside of those just striving towards the ideal of bourgeois marriage. Thousands of self-declared sex radicals took to the practice in the years after its publication, fitting because it emerged out of a long tradition of sex radicalism. One of the earliest radical advocates was the homosexual mystical anarchist J. William Lloyd, who had spent his lifetime exploring Carezza's precursor practices and would over the next 2 decades write various unpublished treatises on Carezza that would circulate through the New York radical milieu. And I have to tell you, as I was in the Wisconsin Historical Archives, I was just lighting up. In fact, I made friends with 2 different archivists there who were just like, this guy needs to shut up. But also he's interesting because Lloyd, I discovered, has this whole chain of relationships with people, sexual and otherwise, which is how Carezza makes its way into the New York bohemian and radical milieu, and then throughout sort of the British socialist milieu. And I was just baffled by how I could find all this there. So Lloyd, for example, lent the well-known bohemian anarchist socialist who had relationships with both men and women, Helena Bourne, his copy of Carezza, which she then recommended to her lover, William Bailey, so that he could understand the power and place of sex in her life. At the same time, he was telling everyone in his circle, including Bourne and a number of other major socialists who were much more well-known than him, which ultimately included Upton Sinclair, about this figure named Edward Carpenter. At the same time, advertisements for Carezza began appearing in many of the most important socialist magazines of the era, including the Vanguard, right above a page-length ad for Karl Marx's writings, and the Comrade, both papers having circulations in the tens of thousands. Similarly, Carezza, through a variety of channels, made its way to Stockham's friend and Lloyd's idol, the world-famous gay English socialist poet Edward Carpenter, who, in his 1897 Love's Coming of Age, laid out a philosophy of love and gender relations that echoed many of Stockham's sentiments, and building explicitly on Stockham's idea that there were 2 different forms of sex, the higher and the lower. One was spiritual, one was physical. Carpenter justified the concept of, quote, the intermediate sex, people who were between men and women and who were attracted to others of their biological sex, and who, Carpenter believed, and in whom Carpenter rested messianic hopes for the redemption of the human race and the destruction of capitalism itself. Carezza, he believed, was the practice that would lead people towards the ultimate destruction of the intertwined evils of what we would now call capitalism and patriarchy, especially within same-sex relationships. Through Carpenter's advocacy, Carezza traveled across the Anglophone world, finding advocates from Australia to England and across the United States. In England, notably, the sexologist Havelock Ellis began practicing it himself, advocating it to his friends and acquaintances, and in his best-selling, and it doesn't sound like it would be best-selling, but trust me on this, Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 6, he even explicitly advocated the practice, quote, as probably the form of coitus which gives women the maximum of gratification and relief. So, when the renowned birth control advocate Margaret Sanger fled Comstock laws in 1913 and took refuge with Ellis and his ilk in England, and of the socialist and birth control advocates in England, he impressed upon her the importance of Carezza to such a degree that she wrote a whole pamphlet advocating for it as a vitally important birth control practice and as a form of spiritually elevating sex, published in 1915. Through the circulation figures of the pamphlet aren't clear, Sanger implies that it was distributed to thousands of women. And in it, she echoes many of the same arguments that Carpenter and Stockham and Lloyd and everyone had made, including noting that, quote, she was publishing this, including, quote, the fact that nearly all women who practice it testify to its benefits, while few men complain of it. As, quote, Carezza must be practiced on a higher plane of thought than the purely physical, then certainly it must tend towards a finer companionship and understanding between men and women than the fleeting physical gratification prevailing at present. In its apogee around 1916, Carezza had sold over 30,000 copies in Germany and over 50,000 copies in the United States, while Love's Coming of Age had sold at least another 50,000, and both works were advertised across New Woman, sex radical, and socialist presses. At the same time, Carezza's influence among new women waned precipitously. In 1909, as I mentioned, Alice Bunker Stockham had her publishing press taken away. And many of her allies, she was old. She was at that instance old, especially for 1909 standards, 76. and died in 1911. And this was the era before Freud made his way into New Woman thought and made his way into sort of liberationist thought. So by 1920, the writings of Freud, more than any other writer, came to dominate New Woman thought, to the extent that, for example, Margaret Sanger's 1920 Women in the New Race joined this growing chorus, discounted carezza explicitly as a birth control practice, though it continued to sing its praises as a spiritual practice. In her 1920 Married Lover, Love and Marriage, Marie Stopes, which is considered a classic work of in the birth control movement, in the New Woman movement, in women's history, recommended carezza explicitly only to men with serious sexual dysfunctions. So what happened? Well, what happened is that carezza, for one moment, catalyzed a whole group of people, a coalition of people who wouldn't necessarily all have known each other or been able to have much to talk about or interact. This is this combination of new women, and we can see it here in the advertisements. It's a combination of new women, of socialists, and new thought people, of mystics. Perhaps the best page to look at this on is this page, where we have Abby Morton Diaz, an important settlement house worker and socialist, together with George Noyes Miller, a eugenicist and one of the descendants of John Humphrey Noyes, with Health Culture, a mainstream sort of health magazine, and the Union Signal, the magazine of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. All of these sort of advocating for this one practice and this one way of being. This was before the idea that sexual liberation meant everyone must orgasm, or there must be a cult of mutual orgasm. And this was in this moment when women were seeking for all manner of especially strivingly upwardly mobile, or people who were seeking to enter the public sphere, women, radicals, and new women in general, practices, theologies that could justify or allow them to do so. And from the advertisements, from the responses to this, from which it's really the only place we can glean about people's private sexual habits, except for radicals who left some manner of a paper trail, we can see that this work deeply affected thousands of people's lives, and was a direct through line, sort of speaks to the impact of the continuing impact of utopian socialism in US society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that fascinating paper. I was excited in the beginning to hear the connection to the Oneidas, who I did a little bit of work on as a graduate student in upstate New York. So I was interested to hear that connection, and also just to think about the purpose of reading Emerson for a couple of weeks leading up to one's use of the powers of fecundity, or rather the control of the fecundating power. It's fascinating. Well, so we have plenty of time. Thank you to our panelists for keeping great time. We have plenty of time for discussion. I asked the first questions yesterday, and I fear that I may have given too much time to myself for question asking. I certainly have questions, but I am also interested in opening up the floor to other panelists and to our list of attendees. Attendees, if you have questions you'd like to put into the Q&A or the chat, right now is a great time to do so. But I'll first invite our co-panelists to ask any questions they might have of Joshua, and Daniel, or also for Daniel and Joshua to have a chance to chat with each other. Does anyone have a question right off the bat, or just a comment? Mark, please go ahead.
I have a question, just relatively simply. I was curious, for Joshua, you had at different points mentioned you were doing work on Canadian prisons as well, and I was just kind of curious, the kind of the rationale for including Canada in your study. Not that it doesn't make sense, not that there aren't reasons for it. I was just kind of curious to hear kind of why Canada was also incorporated into the study, because in my mind, like I think of just the American penal system. So I was curious, kind of the transnational nature.
Yeah, so part of the reason for me to want to include Canada and to travel to Canada to collect some of these papers was because the penal press imagined itself as a transnational enterprise. Some of the papers also would exchange or would read newspapers from outside of North America as well, which I haven't been able to find access of. But there were papers in Cuba and Australia and Uruguay that they were able to read and sort of reference in their own work as well. So they exchanged across the U.S.-Canada border. There was a lot of exchange between the editors in Canada and the editors in prisons in the U.S. So I wanted to include that as part of the story of these papers, because the Canadian papers were a really central part of the exchange and the circuit. Also, Canada is sort of historically interesting because it came late to many of the sort of prison reforms. So I think we sometimes in the US, we imagine that we might imagine that Canada had come earlier to some of these penal reforms, but they were very late, and some of these papers didn't start emerging in Canada until the 1950s, when some of the Canadian prison administrations sort of relaxed their rules on the sort of creation of print material in prisons. So thanks for that question.
There's two questions that just came up from our attendees. One of them for each of our panelists. First, a question for Josh that I think builds off of what you were just discussing. Gabriel Lewis, who is a master's student in the information school, asks, with the records that remain of the penal presses today, is it possible to get a sense of the level of prison administrators' censorship of the publications?
That's a good question. I think, so a lot of the editors for these publications brag that they were uncensored and able to publish whatever they want. I don't take that I don't take their word for that fact, though. I think the biggest way that censorship actually occurred for these papers, because they were government sanctioned papers before the 1960s, most of them, I think the primary way that censorship occurred was actually in the administration's selecting their editorial staff, right? So they were choosing editors and staff writers to work on these prison publications who would many times be mouthpieces for the administration. So I think that's the primary way that censorship occurred, but it's difficult to always get a sense of, what sorts of topics were, other imprisoned people might have wanted to read about or have reported in their papers, because the editors themselves are always promoting the institution, promoting the administration as being free of censorship. So that does create a bit of a historical problem.
Sorry, I was on mute there. And then for Daniel, a question from Susie Seafelt-Lazutra, who is an alumna of our master's program in library information studies and is also a member of the board for the CHPDC. Susie writes, I recently listened to a podcast on the Oneida community. I had no idea the history behind the silverware, but also I visited the site of a different commune, Fruitlands, outside of Boston, started by the Alcott family. To what extent did these various communities adhere to the same vision of sexual mores?
That's a great question. And I think I want to preface it by saying what's really fascinating is that for the past 100 years, I mean, since Marxist socialism became the predominant form of left critique in America, utopian socialism has been really out. And it's fascinating that we're in a moment where there's a revitalization of scholarship on utopian socialism in a million different ways. And it's really fascinating to see all of that grow. And part of that is Eileen, I forgot her last name's book called Oneida, from Utopian Commune to the Well Set Table. And there's just an outpouring of works. There's a book called American Messiahs that just came out last year. There's a book called Utopia Drive that just came out 2 years ago. There's a book called, there's Black Utopians, which is about African-American utopian socialists or utopian communes. And the truth is, there's this massive American tradition of utopian socialism that places overwhelmingly women and women's rights, or what was called in the 19th century the sex question, at the center, and answers it in a million different ways. So Fruitlands, Abby Morton Diaz, whom I just mentioned, actually grew up on Fruitlands, but she doesn't share their sexual mores. Fruitlands was, it died really quickly, right? As opposed to Oneida, which lasted for generations. And Oneida was really hierarchically organized around John Humphrey Noyes. So they did not really share the same sexual mores, but they shared a lot of the same sexual theology. This question of the idea of egalitarianism being able to emancipate women, and that sex should be one more way in which women experience complete, or at least as much as possible, equality with men. And that's something you see throughout the utopian socialist tradition, even if in practice, for example, at Oneida, that's just not the case. In practice, right, it's John Humphrey Noyes' little private playground. He pulls relationships apart. He does whatever he wants. And there's a woman, she wrote a diary. You can read this woman's diary. Her name is Tirza Miller. It sort of goes with, it shows you what the actual experience of a woman is like at least in Oneida, as opposed to sort of the glorified accounts that Noyes gives. But yeah, I would encourage you, like, if you're interested, there's this massive literature and there's all different solutions to the same problem, but they all sort of start with transcendentalist philosophy, which of course comes or is directly connected to Fruitlands.
Great, thank you. Perhaps a related question came in the Q&A from John Beekman, which is could you say a little bit, Daniel, about how Noyes's work has been critiqued in the present scholarship?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I have this little section I've been working on called like the sins of the fathers, because all of these utopians that my figures work on, kind of terrible, like as people, just frankly. Walt Whitman was a capitalist. He was, he's kind of bad to the women around him. He was virulently racist. And yet he becomes the basis for a certain kind of anti-racist, social critique. And Noyes, similarly in the scholarship, the basic consensus since, I'm forgetting all the authors' names, but Lewis Kern in Ordered Love set the standard for this in 1984. Basically, they were all trying to create new orderings of sexuality. And Noyes, the critique of Noyes basically amounted to, male continence wasn't the only thing that was practiced. It was called Bible communism. It was a whole philosophy for every aspect of everyday life, and Noyes was the person who controlled it. It was the idea is that the goal is to live like you do in Eden, but Noyes is the translator between heaven and earth. So it's equality for all, but more equality for Noyes. So that's one critique of Noyes' scholarship, that basically it is, and of course, and he wants to turn women into men, right? He sees the ultimate goal in the introduction of Bible communism being to create a woman man, right? He's not, so there's distinctly limits to his notion of what women's equality can mean. And ultimately, Noyes breaks up a lot of, and also Noyes has this weird thing where he really believes that all young people should be indoctrinated into sex by old people. Specifically, like people in the latter stages of their lives should be having sex with young people, and he should determine who those people are. And that's actually what got him run out of the country to Canada. So there's a lot of, but the ultimate critique, and it's this big question, is Noyes a feminist? And I think the ultimate sort of middle ground on this, in an article called Is Noyes a Feminist by Lewis Kern, the middle ground that he comes to is like, it's complicated. His supporters, including his descendant who wrote this recent book, say he was the most, feminist person in the 19th century. which isn't true if you just read other feminists in the 19th century. But his detractors say, you know, he was absolutely horrible, controlling everyone's life, which isn't true either. He did provide a lot of people the bases and a good philosophy on which to build a manner of equality. Somewhere in between the two is the scholarly consensus and critique right now. I'm sorry, that was too long. That was a long response. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's great. I wanted to ask a question that I think cuts across all the presentations for the last 2 mornings. And while Joshua was talking about the presence of printing presses in prisons, mimeograph machines, silk screening facilities, just for Josh in particular, I'm super fascinated about the ways in which tools for carceral capitalism, presses on which the incarcerated are producing state documents, for example, are then repurposed for the penal press and for the communication, self-expression, and also, you know, just the pleasure, the non-purposive use of the means of print production. Really reminded me about Derek's presentation yesterday about the seizure of presses for anti-war organizing, for example, but also just, you know, across the presentations we've heard over the last 2 mornings. I would love to hear more from anyone who this question makes you think about something in your own work, about how, as we say in the center's mission statement, how people at the periphery of power find and use print for their purposes, and even in Daniel's paper that we just heard, you know, part of the spread and circulation of mystic feminist socialist ideas has to do with the fact that the woman whose name is escaping me now, who writes Carezza, let me get it from my notes here, Alice B. Stockham, you know, she also owns a publishing house, right? So you know, if you're interested to, you know, say more about this question of being at the periphery of power and yet finding routes to print, or finding ways into the circulation of print.
I mean, I could say a bit about this use of the prisons print studios, because as you mentioned, yes, many state prisons had their own print workshops, and those shops were used to print state government documents. And you talked about, you know, your question is about how they got repurposed. In some ways, I do think it's a repurposing, but in other ways, I think the papers did function as government documents in other ways. So actually, if you go to many of these state libraries where these penal press newspapers are housed and archived, they're almost always indexed as government publications, as government periodicals. And as I mentioned in response to the earlier question, even though they could sometimes, the editors and the staff writers could sometimes have a degree of criticism of their administrations and would sometimes make requests or demands of their administrations, the papers themselves were often seen by administrators as being promotional for the prisons, as a way to demonstrate the types of rehabilitation and reform that they were sort of training people into as part of the, as part of training them to be journalists. Of course, there is a repurposing in the sense that these papers were also meaningful in a lot of imprisoned people's lives, and the exchange was really meaningful as well, in spite of the fact that the administrative sanction of these papers, sort of delimited what kinds of content could show up in them as well. So yeah, it's a I think a complex question of thinking about the, if these prison print studios were being repurposed, and to what extent they were being repurposed. But certainly having access to that that sort of publication tool was meaningful to the readership, and we have a lot of evidence of that. Thanks.
If no one else has an answer, I have one, but I'm really curious about some of the other panelists.
I could jump in. I saw, or
go ahead,
Derek.
I'll go after you. Yeah.
Okay. I saw Daniel's comment. So I have some of the, I don't know if this is visible, some of the copies from the Women's Service Club, the private organization that I was able to research last year that hasn't made it into the archives yet. So this has been one of the richest sources, I think, to sort of get an idea of how this middle class, sort of religiously oriented club tried to professionalize the domestic workers and offer them services. A lot of it is just mediated through the words of the middle class organizers. So I mean, there's this nice Valentine's Day poem, and on traditional Christian holidays, Christmas and Easter, there's a lot of kind of pontification and those values. And a lot of the newsletter is used to kind of brag about the club services for these underprivileged domestic workers. So there's definitely class overtones to it. The club is receiving government funding through the War on Poverty funds, right? So they're having to sell a certain image of these domestic workers being powerless and ignorant, and all of these different sorts of tropes. But reading closely, I mean, you can get some perspective from the workers themselves. They write in to talk about their accomplishments in getting citizenship. There's a lot of migrants coming up from the Caribbean. And so they talk about family reunification and taking basic adult education classes and that sort of thing. So I think, like, in thinking of Joshua's presentation with the penal press and the idea of censorship, a lot of this is, I mean, I have to take it with a grain of salt. It's not all of the workers' words, but to some extent we can get a little bit of their experiences. It is heavily mediated, though.
Yeah, Jonathan, I hope this speaks to your question, but the sort of one of the overarching points that struck me the most, reading a lot of different GI newspapers, and then especially at the Wisconsin Historical Society, reading a few papers closely that also had like organizational archives at the Wisconsin Historical Society with letters and internal memos and things like that. Was really able to sort of put together a sense of like the extent to which this underground press was able to like function as a vehicle to allow service members that were often isolated or experiencing things very, very locally, depending on like what base they were on, what service they were in, where they were in the world, but who sort of had the latent discontent and were opposed to the war and how this was able to sort of the press was something in which they were able to plug into sort of a sort of global identity, a sense of being connected to others in their position, sometimes discovering and finding others locally in their position, but like really just the language and the icons and the stories and the narratives that was in the GI press allowed, the creation of a kind of coherent, if like very decentralized, movement of global descent that in which the different parts were connected to each other in different ways.
If I may jump in and add to that, and also in some ways connected to Heather's question in the chat, I think my whole dissertation, this is the central problem. Both Heather's question and this question of printing presses. It's the early 20th century, so printing presses are constantly being shut down. And then the question becomes, who actually has access to these materials as they circulate? Like who's reading Stockham's advertising outside of who are the readers of the Nautilus of these places, and how are they translating, especially say the sexual practice? Or my next chapter is on Edward Carpenter's Love's Coming of Age, which is I brought up in this. How are people? What are they doing with these things once they have them and have access to them? And how does that process of them getting these documents happen? And so for a lot of this, you have, like, Stockham starts off as a New Thought publisher. She publishes all this mystical stuff, and then she becomes politicized quite late in her life around, suffrage. She's always a suffragist, but then in the early 1900s, she becomes a socialist. And so she veers her publishing house to the left and then aligns it with Charles Kerr and pushes him to New Thought, like to religion to some degree. But the way, like, sort of the networks by which these things can even come into being and circulate is really complicated, because it's where are they advertising and what friendship networks are recommending what to whom. Because if you're talking about the counterculture, it's about how do you know that this occult manual is better than this? There's a lot of occult sexual manuals published between 1896 and 1920. Believe me, a lot. Wait, you think how there's more. And then why this one? And I think the answer is always because of certain networks of trust that were gained first through Stockham, and then just sort of this luck of it happened to be her press in her moment where she was advertising. And then it happened to be this network of confidants that ended up picking up these things and finding them lying around, or someone recommended it to someone. To Heather's question, in 1950, there's this book called The Circle of Sex by a guy named Gavin Arthur, who's the great grandson of Chester A. Arthur. And it's actually relatively important to a small subsection of like the sexual liberationists of that era. And specifically sort of like pre-queer liberation, sort of gay self-identity. And that book talks, it's Carezza's all over it. And the guy even claims to have had Carezza sex with Edward Carpenter. And so you have these weird echoes of this, right? Alan Watts talks about Carezza sex. H.G. Wells in the 1940s, it's a part of his utopia. It echoes in all these interesting ways. That's less the actual like physical text, but that's the echoes of this idea, which I don't know if that's exactly your question, Heather, but I hope it's connected to it enough.
Well, thank you everyone for these papers for the last 2 mornings. We're going to take a break in a second ahead of our closing keynote. I just wanted to reiterate that the Danky Pawley Symposium in Print Culture History celebrates and reflects on 10 years of James P. Danky Fellowships administered by the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture and the Wisconsin Historical Society. We have heard papers from 6 of the previous Danky Fellows. I just wanted to name the other Danky Fellows who weren't able to join us for the sort of reunion of this symposium, reunion for us who have been able to meet all of them, but it also, we were looking forward to an opportunity for fellows to hear each other's work through this forum, which our fellows here very clearly have, and I'm excited to see how their work talks to each other going forward. But our other former fellows who were unable to join us for the symposium are Julia Guarnieri, William Sturkey, Josh Mound, Sarita Alami, Ian Bleckschmidt, and Ashley Farmer. So you can see their work out in the world, as well as the work of the fellows who you've heard papers from these last 2 mornings. We're going to take just under a 10-minute break. I want to again thank all of our panelists this morning in particular, and also from yesterday. Thank you so much. We will come back at 10:30 for our closing keynote from Maria Del Bello. Thank you all, and see you in about 10 minutes.